Good evening and welcome to the February meeting of the Linnaean Society of New York. I'm Debbie Mullins, the president, and I call the meeting to order. Our annual meeting is just 4 weeks away on March the 11th. Be sure to register to attend. You can register online at members.linnaeannewyork.org/events. The meeting is for society members only, but if you're not a member, you can still join in time to come to the meeting. The membership application is on our website. The annual meeting is at the Liederkranz Club again on East 87th Street, and it starts at 7:30. The meeting is free of charge, so I encourage everyone to attend. There will also be a cocktail reception before the meeting at 6 o'clock, and tickets to the reception are $135 per person. Dr. Brian Watts is this year's recipient of the Eisenman Medal, and he'll give the keynote address entitled Eagles of the Chesapeake. Other award winners this year include Dr. Dustin Partridge, Director of Conservation and Science at the New York City Bird Alliance, who will receive the Natural History Service Award, and Jennifer Stalick, a teacher at Eleanor Roosevelt High School, who will be honored with the Shelda Taylor Award. We're selling raffle tickets for $5 for some very good prizes, and we also will be having a silent auction with several really good things, including original artwork by Alan Messer, a private boat tour of Jamaica Bay led by Don Reapy, handmade silver jewelry, and many other things. We still need a few volunteers for that evening, so if you can help, would you please send me an email, president@linnaeannewyork.org. Again, the URL to register for the meeting is members.linnaeannewyork.org/events. This month, we have 3 new members to welcome to the Society. They are Joseph McManus, Peter Prawl, and Julia Zachello. We're happy to have you as members. Thanks for joining. And please join us on an upcoming field trip or at the annual meeting so that we'll have an opportunity to greet you in person. I'm really excited about the program tonight. As usual, we've muted your microphone and disabled the chat. So if you have questions for Dr. Hochachka, please type them into the Q&A function of Zoom. Vice President Doug Futuma will moderate the question and answer session after the talk. Wesley Hochachka is a senior research associate at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where he has worked since 1998. Originally from Alberta, Canada, Wesley obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Alberta and his PhD from the University of British Columbia. During his formal training, Wesley was involved in field studies of birds, but his PhD research on song sparrows exposed him to the value of pre-existing data. From his PhD onward, Wesley has worked with increasingly large collections of data, and his experience brought him to the Lab of Ornithology, where he has mainly worked with Project Feeder Watch, the House Finch Disease Survey, and eBird. The title of his presentation tonight is Informing Basic Science and Conservation with Birdwatchers' Observations, and a lot of computers. Wesley, thank you so much, and welcome to the Linnaean Society.
Okay, thank you very much, Debbie. Okay, I will turn on my video and I will start sharing my screen. And I presume that if people cannot see the presentation, somebody will let me know. So that should be shared. And let me just organize my screen a little bit more so I can see everything. And then we will begin. So good evening, everybody, and thank you for your interest in the topic of what can be done, or what we have been doing at the Lab of Ornithology with data from the eBird project. And so what I'd like to do today is give you a very quick tour through eBird, assuming that you already have a basic idea that it's a participatory science or citizen science project that collects data from bird watchers. And unlike other ways that times if you've had eBird described to you, I'm going to describe the project to you from the perspective of somebody who is interested in analyzing the data from eBird. So not how we collect the data and manage the data, but really what we do once the data are in the database and what we're trying at the Lab of Ornithology to do with the data. And I'm very consciously using the plural we here, because what I'm going to be talking about today isn't my work. I've been part of almost all of this, but it's the work of a group of people, data analysts, machine learning specialists, data scientists, and most of whom are bird watchers as well, where we're taking the data that are being contributed to eBird and then trying to put them to the best possible use to try and extract the greatest amount of knowledge from these data. And I'm starting with this opening slide, this opening screen for three particular reasons. There are 3 points I want to actually start you thinking about as we're going through the talk. So what you're seeing on the screen is a map of the world, and every single eBird checklist from a certain point in time, about a year and a half ago, is a dot on that map. So where you see areas of the brighter, lighter colored yellow, those are the areas of the highest density of data. And the highest density of data in the world is located right in the northeastern states and adjacent parts of Canada. And so the first thing is you don't have to count the points. I'll tell you right now that there are approximately, as of 3 or 4 hours ago, 111 million checklists of birds display that we have records for. These are the sort of the basic data that we can work with. The second thing I want you to think about and notice from the screen is that these 111 million checklists of data are not evenly distributed across the globe. So there are areas like the northeastern United States and the west coast of North America that have very high densities of data, but not just in North America, but if you also look across to Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, England, go further, and you can see in southern India, and then go even further into East Asia, Taiwan, and then south to Australia and New Zealand. There we have patches of high densities of data places around the world, but we also have places in the world where almost no data exist. The Sahara and Sahel regions of Africa, parts of the Tibetan Plateau, Siberia, and then in South America, parts of the Amazon basin as well. There are very few data. So the point here that I'm trying to make is that we have lots of data, but they're complicated and noisy. They were not created from a designed, sort of a carefully designed study perspective. And that's the third point, where the reason for this patchiness in the data is that in a carefully designed bird survey, like if for those of you familiar with the North American Breeding Bird Survey, you are told where to go, what day of the year to go to look for birds, how much time you spend counting birds at a given location, how far you travel at a given point. All of this is very tightly controlled so that you have a nice, neat, even distribution of data, hopefully, with which to work. eBird is completely the opposite. We basically are relying on people to go out and watch birds and record birds where they want to be, when they want to be, spending as much time as they want at the time of day that they want when they're recording birds. And the result is a data set that's very dense, lots of data, very patchily distributed, and noisy in the sense of a low signal to noise ratio. There's biological information, but there's also a lot of variation just caused by the differences in the process that people are going through to when they're bird watching around the world. Now, so eBird is sort of two different things. One of them, it's a data management tool. That's the part of it that I'm assuming that most of you are familiar. We actually provide services for people. We can help make it easy to record the observations of birds, and we maintain them as well. So when there are changes in taxonomy, when there's splits of species or species are lumped together, we actually go through the database and make all those changes for people. So the fact that we have noisy data is because we make it easy for bird watchers to use eBird. And the flip side of that is it makes it easy for lots of people to want to use eBird around the world, which gives us the large quantities of data that we're able to use. And the way we work with eBird generally, before I actually dive into the data analysis, is that we have an organizational structure where there are basically three tasks and three types of responsibilities of the staff. The first one is working with partners, partner organizations, and the global birding community to try and make it as enjoyable for bird watchers to watch and record birds as possible so that we can actually gather the information for use in basic research and conservation management, even setting policy. And when I say partnership, I do mean that in the true sense of the word, where we are communicating with the organizations with whom we work. And this is very important. So there are places in the world, like I'd mentioned Taiwan and Birds India, where the reason why they stand out so clearly in that map of the density of eBird data is because these organizations are locally within their countries promoting the use of eBird, collecting data that they want, but letting us do the data management for them. There are other organizations like Birds Canada and Canabio in Mexico that have set us down the road of internationalizing eBird, where we have multiple languages and not just English. And we extend the scope beyond the US and Canada, then into Central America, and eventually the world. And there are other organizations, for example, The Rock in Chile or Birds New Zealand, that have been pushing us and saying, we don't want to just collect information about counts of birds or observations of birds. We'd actually like to be able to record information about nesting, like the nest evidence, for which is what pushed us into having the ability to record and manage breeding bird atlases in North America and actually anywhere in the world. So there's a very much this partnership part of eBird is a very important part of what maintains eBird and what allows it to grow the amounts of data that we're collecting. And then, of course, when you have a large amount of data, you need a group that is thinking about all the infrastructure behind the scene, maintaining and building the computer infrastructure to collect the data to safely and securely house the data. And in this case, what the group, maybe one of the interesting things about this is that the people in our infrastructure group, they're all employees. We don't use contractors. And that means that we have people full-time able to fix bugs when they show up. And we have people, and then when they're not doing that, most of the time they're spent developing, always trying to improve the project, improve the phone apps, improve the database in the back end, improve the experience for the people who are using eBird. The final task group is the one with which I belong. That's the group that are turning the data into knowledge, the data analyst group. And maybe some of you had a question, why do you actually need a group, and a fairly substantial group of people, to analyze data from eBird? Why can't you just collect the data and make them available, and then people can use them for good, for whatever purposes they want? And there are three main reasons why it's been important for us to have this data analysis group. And one of them has to do with the fact that the data, there are large quantities of data, and the data are noisy. And with large quantities of data, what this basically means is you right now, not necessarily right now, but within a few days of setting everything up, could download all of the eBird data in the world. The problem is, what do you do with it? Because eBird is a no Excel zone. The world's most popular data analysis tools simply won't work because there are too many data. I mean, you could find some sets of data that should fit, like all the data from Vatican City or all the data from Liechtenstein, but the United States, no. New York State, even, no, it's not going to work. So what we've needed to do is actually have this group of people thinking about methods for using the data and actually making the data accessible, not just to us, but other people around the world. And also, because the data, as I mentioned, are noisy, there's a low signal to noise ratio. We've needed this group of people to think about how we actually boost the signal and reduce the noise in the data. So we've actually discovered information about how to process and deal with some of the nuances of eBird data. And we haven't just figured this out for our own purposes. We definitely need it for our own purposes, but we've been able to take what we've learned. In addition to making the data available for people, we've been producing resources. I'm just showing you the opening page of a website on eBird best practices, which basically walks people through the process of being able to download the data and then manage the data, filter it down to a manageable amount of data for themselves, and then to basically use the best possible methods of which we're currently aware to extract knowledge and insights from these data. But the main thing that we do is we analyze data. And the reason, again, why do we need our own internal group to do this? And that's, again, comes back to the complexity of the data and the sheer volumes of data that are being used. For those of you who've seen various distribution maps and models and other products that we produce, you don't make those on your home computer. We actually need to use high performance computer systems, supercomputer systems, if you will, in order to analyze the data. And currently, and for the last several years, we've been relying on high performance computer systems that are managed by the National Science Foundation, currently the NSF Access program, where instead of applying for money, grants to do research, you apply for hours of computer time in order to do these sorts of analyses that you need. So effectively, what we need we need this large data analyst group to do the sorts of analyses that it's probably simply impossible for most other people to be able to conceive of doing, and then making these products available for other people to use. There's a standard recipe that we use for analyzing data in eBird, and that involves starting with three basic ingredients. One is the bird observations from eBird data. And because each observation has a location attached to it, we can connect the observations of birds with information about the environments around the area of observation, the types of habitats, the topography, the elevation, and also at the weather within a few hours of the time of observation, all coming from remotely sensed data. So we rely very heavily on data products produced by NASA to do that. The third ingredient is information on observer effort, which is usually automatically provided when people are collecting observations on their phone apps to send to eBird. And again, the effort information describes the noise that causes the low signal to noise ratio we have in the data. And actually the greatest proportion of variation in which birds are reported from one checklist to another in a region aren't caused by differences in whether the birds are present or not. They're actually caused by differences in what observers are doing in one observation period with one checklist compared to another. So we need to actually filter out the effort and the variation effort. We need to filter out the noise so that we can find connections between the bird observations and features of the environment. And we use that to make the maps that you're used to seeing. And one of the reasons why we need so much the high performance computer systems to do that is that when we do an analysis, we're not just doing an analysis. We're not just looking at effectively one process of finding associations between birds and their environments and controlling for effort. But we're doing this hundreds of and thousands of times over the range of a species, especially species that would have an Americas-wide or global distribution. And what you're seeing on the right-hand side of your screen is just an example of a small proportion of these local analyses that we're doing. So every rectangular box represents a spatial region, but also a certain period of time of about a month in which we do the matching of bird distributions to environment, controlling for effort. And then and this is, as I mentioned, a small quantity, so that any point on that map should probably have between 50, typically for our analyses, between 50 and 100 of these local space-time models fit with slightly or partially overlapping data. And then when we're making a prediction, when we're saying this is the likelihood, this is what we think is the abundance or relative abundance of birds at this location, it's actually the average, drilling down through all of those models, all 50 to 100 models, to come up with one average. The reason why we're doing this is because we've learned through experience that one way of saying is that information drifts or travels around. As a more concrete example, think of yellow warblers, species with very wide breeding distribution in North America. There's even a small population in southern Florida, just a northern extent of the range, of a specialist form of yellow warblers that nest in mangrove swamps in the Caribbean and then in mangroves along Central America. Now we can learn the associations between these yellow warblers and their environments, but we don't want any of this information to be used to try and help us understand where yellow warblers are going to be nesting in Alaska. And if you don't actually keep the information from different points in time in different areas of space separate, you get very, very strange and very embarrassingly bad predictions of where birds are going to be. I mean, effectively what we've been doing for the last 20 years is dealing with computer hallucinations, well before ChatGPT made it popular for computers to hallucinate. So our solution to trying to control for these hallucinations, to try and keep knowledge of associations between birds and their environments local, is to do many of these models. And each one of these models would be fit by a single computer processor, so that we actually can run hundreds or thousands of these local models in parallel in order to build up the final products with which I presume that many of you are familiar. We've got two main products that we are producing. One of them is the things that we call the status data products. These are descriptions of distribution relative abundance of birds. We make these predictions or these models of distribution relative abundance weekly. So there are 52 of these predictions at 1 week intervals throughout the entire calendar year. And we can take this basic information and then combine them into different visual representations of the data, such as the one that you're seeing on the screen right now, which is a relative abundance model for wood thrushes, but which shows them the relative abundance throughout the year by combining or stacking these 52 individual weekly predictions. And on a map like this, in red on this map, you can see the summer distribution. The deeper the red is, the higher the density or relative abundance of birds. Like we're not predicting with this what exactly how many wood thrushes there are at a given location, but instead it's just more or less. And that's really all that we can do with eBird data when they're just used exclusively by themselves. And you can also see in these models in green and in yellow areas where the wood thrushes are migrating, but they're not nesting. And you can also see in blue then in Central America, they're wintering grounds as well. So this information is available as sorts of maps that you can find on our website, but also as the raw data, the numbers that are underlying these. So somebody can actually take and create their own custom subsets of the data if they want to. One other thing to remember or to know about these maps is that they're not based on having somebody counting wood thrushes at every single location on every week of the year. What they are, they're predictions of where wood thrushes are likely to be based on the habitats at locations throughout their range at all times of year. So we're making use of local knowledge within a region to produce what looks like a sort of a smooth surface, and is actually effectively every 3 kilometers across the range, there's a separate prediction, and there's a little point of that prediction. And when you zoom back and sit back from those, it looks like a nice smooth surface. But these are predictions based on regional knowledge of associations between birds and their environments. The second main type of data product that we're producing now are the eBird trend products. Now, what these are, when we say trend, is as on the screen that I have the words a monotonic average rate of change of population size, which is a mouthful to just say we're only basically asking whether you can describe changes in counts and abundances of birds as being a continual decrease of some type, or continual increase, or just a flat line of no change. And again, these predictions are based on the local environments and the local or regional trends in the data. The way that you interpret these maps are that there's a dot on a grid every 27 kilometers apart, north, south, and east, west. And there's the size of the dot, the diameter of the dot, tells how abundant birds are. They're more abundant where the dots are bigger. They're less abundant where the dots are just down to tiny points. And then color coded on that are the trends described as percent per year changes in the birds. So that in the Midwest, you're seeing typically that wood thrushes are increasing, whereas on the East Coast in red, you're seeing that their wood thrush populations are declining over the period from 2012 to 2022 in this map. Now, again, we produce maps, but we also produce the raw data underlying them that people can take and they can do with as they will for their own analyses and their own purposes. Those are the two data products we have now. What we are in the process of developing are something that we call eBird trajectory data products. And it might sound like they're the same thing as trends, and we're using these words as jargon internally so that we know what we're talking about. But Effectively, right now, the eBird trends are different from the trends analyses and the trend output from the North American Breeding Bird Survey. And what you're seeing on the right of your screen is a typical example, again for wood thrush, of what a trajectory looks like. And this is from the North American Breeding Bird Survey analyses that are being conducted. And it's not a smooth, continuous change in population size, but you can actually see from year to year how the predictions of populations they're allowed to fluctuate year to year, and you can have quite periods of stability, declines followed by increases. You can have basically any arbitrary shape, and it's easy to do with breeding bird survey because the data are collected in a much more controlled manner so that you don't have to worry about as much noise because there basically shouldn't be any variation in what the birders are doing when they're collecting breeding bird survey data from point to point, from year to year. It should be all the same. And it's a lot more complicated to deal with the fluctuations in birder behavior with the data from eBird. As an extreme example, take the COVID lockdowns, where we know that birder behavior changed. By and large, across the world, people, during lockdowns, stayed in more urban areas. They spent less time on a given day, typically looking for birds. And so an apparent change in counts of birds would very likely be a change in the behavior of bird watchers through time and not having anything to do with the changes in behavior of the birds themselves or the abundance of birds. And try to tease apart these changes in behavior from the changes in actual population sizes when we actually don't know. The people are not telling us where they weren't bird watching. So we have to try and infer that directly. And there are recent methods and analysis methods that allow us to do hopefully a very good job of that. But these products, as I mentioned, are still in development for us. Now, collecting the data was the start. The next step is producing the status and trends data products, which are effectively just summaries of the raw data, but very complex summaries. But that isn't necessarily what our partners want. And when I say partners, people who are willing to use the data in this case, for example, what you're seeing on the right side of the screen are all of the organizations that are part of NABC, the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, who are interested in understanding what's affecting the distributions, abundance, and changes in population sizes of birds. And part of the information that they use come from the eBird and status and trend products. But they don't actually really want just to have everything thrown at them, but they want more targeted summaries of the data for use to develop policy and develop conservation initiatives. And at the Lab of Ornithology, because we created the data, we're probably best placed to efficiently be able to produce much more tailored data products for individual groups. And what I'm going to be doing next is stepping you through some examples of the sorts of things that we're doing with eBird data to give people these more tailored data products. The first example is what we call the stewardship maps. For every state in the United States, we have a stewardship map for migratory bird species. The rationale being that for migratory birds to be managed so that their populations are stable, are healthy, you need to understand not just where they are and what they're doing in the breeding grounds, but also the wintering grounds as well, the non-breeding grounds. And these maps are a first step in the process of just understanding connections between breeding and non-breeding. So in this case, we've identified 57 species that we're calling migratory bird species, for which New York State has some non-trivial responsibility of managing the bird that species in the nesting season. These species, they're all migratory, so they're all almost entirely leave New York State in the non-breeding season. And what you're seeing in the different colors are the proportions of individuals of these species and how they're distributed in the non-breeding season. So the deepest, darkest colors are the cases where these species, the greatest number of species and individuals of species that are nesting in New York are spending the winter, and that's going to be in the southern Yucatan Peninsula and then through to Honduras. Now, this doesn't say that our birds in New York State are all going to these areas. And that's quite clear because when you look at the map, you see that some New York State breeding species are spending the non-breeding season on the west coast of North America. Those are definitely not New York State birds. But what you're seeing is parts of the populations of species that nest in New York State. Other parts of some parts of these, like the North American white population, are spending the winter in the northwest U.S. and across and just into British Columbia. Yellow-rumped warbler is probably part of driving this. But so it's a first step in identifying where there are probably connections between birds in New York State and birds in their wintering ground in Central America. And to get any closer than that, eBird isn't the tool to use. You actually need to do things like look for connectedness on a genetic basis between breeding and non-breeding grounds, or attach radio transmitters or satellite tags to birds and be able to follow individual birds from specific locations in the sun, in their breeding grounds, to see if they all tend to also cluster again on their wintering grounds. So it's a starting point in trying to help people inform what sort of further research and some initial steps in just thinking about connections and preserving wintering and breeding habitats for birds. So that's one of the products that we're producing. Another one is much more pragmatically practical, and that is minimizing the impacts of development. So anytime people do something to modify habitat, we are almost certainly going to be having a detrimental effect on some species. And we want to try and minimize these detrimental impacts. One particular case in point are eagles in the United States and the siting of wind turbine farms. There's actually part of the permitting process is to try and avoid having major concentrations of wind turbines in areas where there are going to be major concentrations of eagles. And with the map that you're seeing on the left side of the screen, the darker colors show where there are the most eagles at some time of year in the United States. The deeper colors, more yellows and oranges, eagles, and are less likely to be present. And this is both bald eagle and golden eagle combined, by the way. And if you take, so that tells us where the eagles are. If you were to invert that map, what you get is what you see on the right. Basically, the green shows the areas where it's least likely in the United States for there to be any potential for an eagle to come into the proximity of a wind turbine. So automatically what you're able from the status data products to be able to make suggestions for policy purposes about where you have to be concerned about the siting of wind turbines for eagle collisions and where it's not something that needs to be considered at all, a potentially serious problem. That's a second type of data, actually tertiary, third level data product we're producing. And this, in the previous example of the stewardship maps, just involved making use of the information that we already had produced in the status and trend data products that we're producing for entire species distributions. But sometimes there are management problems for which we don't actually have the correct information in these sort of industrial data products that we're cranking out for species after species. One of the cases of that is for the management of fire-dependent bird species, like the Bachman sparrow perched on the top of the screen here. And Bachman sparrows and other species in the southeastern United States are known as fire-dependent species. The habitats in which they need only exist because of relatively frequent fires disturbing and keeping the habitats in a state that provides the necessary environments for these species. But fires aren't all equal. There can be intense fires, high intensity fires, low intensity fires. Fires can occur very frequently, or they can occur at very low intervals. And so for actually trying to figure out how you are managing, suppose you have a plot of land where you can actually do fire management, how frequently do you burn? That's the question, one of the questions that we were asked for Bachman sparrow and a few other species. Now, the data do exist about, the data exists on where fires have actually occurred in the United States. And that's shown in the map in the lower left. So we know where the fires occurred, how frequently they occurred. So we took this information, we added it to the existing information used to produce our trends data products. And we reran the models. So a special custom tailored bespoke analysis for Bachman sparrow. And the results, and one of the results we found is shown on the larger map of the southeastern United States on the right-hand side of your screen. And in this map, like the others we're using, there's an effect, the darker the color, the stronger the effect. And green means a positive effect of the number of fires in a 10-year period on the population's sort of population size and health of populations of Bachman sparrows. The pink, which is shown only in a very, very light shading, is it showing, for example, in the very southern part of the bird's range in southern Florida, is showing places where higher frequency of fires was somewhat detrimental to the populations of Bachman sparrows. So what we're really seeing sort of at a large level is that the frequency of fires and the sort of management recommendations you would make for managing habitat for Bachman sparrows isn't the same everywhere. In some areas like north central Florida, you want to burn relatively frequently. In other areas like far southern Florida, you don't want to burn at such high intervals if you want to keep the populations of Bachman sparrows healthy. So we're able then to provide these sort of tailored products for cases like this, where there's specialized analyses are needed, because we already have most of the infrastructure and the data needed to do these analyses, and we just need to add some extra information of interest to the managers to try and see it, find associations between health of populations and some sort of management or some sort of, that possibly can be done. Now, so far what I've been doing is talking to you about how eBird data and eBird data by themselves are able to do some really useful things, provide really useful insights for the setting of policy, for general management recommendations, and for very on the ground, localized, specific management actions. But I don't want to leave you with the idea that eBird can do everything, because it can't, not on its own. So what I'm going to be concluding with the last examples are talking about complementarity. And I mean this in two senses. One of them is what I'd call the construction tools form of complementarity, where a different tool, a different data set is useful for a different purpose. You don't want to use a hammer for everything when you're building a house. You don't want to use eBird data for every single possible application where you need information from bird surveys. The other sort of complementarity is what I'm calling the peanut butter and jam complementarity, where there are two things, two products, two data sources that are each useful, but when you combine them together, they're by and large better and more useful than the sum of their parts. Now, and I'm going to be showing you examples of what I mean by each of these two things. When the building tool complementary, it's basically different tools for different tasks. And in this case, I'm going to be talking about two data sets, eBird and the North American Breeding Bird Survey. And sometimes the breeding bird survey data are more useful, sometimes eBird data are more useful. And the distinction of which one might be better for a given purpose is effectively all about detection. Different bird species are more easily seen in their preferred habitat, and their preferred habitat is more widespread. There might be more easily seen at some times of day than others, some times of year than others. And a really tailored and rigorously designed project like the Breeding Bird Survey is designed to be very good at detecting some species of birds. And its specialization into the times of year and the times of day in which you could see the birds makes it good at finding these species, but it also makes it poor at finding other species. So with the Breeding Bird Survey, it's very good at detecting widespread species that are fairly uniformly distributed across the landscape. So that the 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 systematically chosen stops, the 50 stops on a breeding bird survey route, are likely to be in habitat where the species could be present. Breeding bird survey is a morning survey, so it's morning active species. Breeding bird survey routes avoid urban areas, so it's good for non-urban species and for species that are highly visible and vocal, because you only have 3 minutes at a stop to find all the birds that you can. Breeding bird survey then has trouble detecting well and describing well the trends in populations of patchily distributed species, nocturnal species like owls or nightjars, urban species like chimney swifts, and species that are cryptic and that take more than 3 minutes to find a bird, given that it's actually there. So different tools, sometimes breeding bird survey data are probably certainly your preferred source of data to learn about population trends for birds like doves, for example. For others like swifts and owls and nightjars, eBird probably has more information with which you can try and understand how populations are faring. Complementarity and combination, the peanut butter and jam analogy, is an example of that we've been involved in is with eagles in the lower 48 states, where there are very rigorously designed aerial surveys in the Western United States that allow you to not just say there are more eagles here and fewer there, but actually tell you there is this density of eagles, eagles per 100 square miles in this area, and that difference from another. And they can make these estimates with specified levels of confidence, how certain they are of that. The only problem is that the way this is designed, you can only make these estimates of density and the confidence in big blocks of space, like the 4 different areas you see in the map on the left-hand side of the screen. eBird, on the other hand, can't estimate actual densities. We just know where they're more or fewer, but we also have the ability to have a much finer grained idea of where eagles are concentrated and where they're not. Some of my colleagues brought together the data from the two sources, and what they were able to do is produce the map you see on the right-hand side of their screen, where they could actually calculate densities and variations in densities in these regions that previously had just been basically assigned a density, 4 different densities for the 4 different regions. So there's a lot of ability to complement that we're learning to explore how to make the most of this complementarity. A final example that I'm just going to mention is not something that we're doing now, but something that we realize we're almost certainly going to be involved in the midterm future. And that is complementarity and exploring the complementarity between eBird data and data from audio recording units. With the improvements in the ability of computer recognition of bird song, we actually have the ability to produce relatively cheaply recording devices like the one that you're seeing in the picture on the left-hand side of the screen. We're going to be able to collect data, a lot of data from something that's effectively an observer, who's very, very patient, who can sit out for days and nights in the cold and the rain, listening for birds and detecting them. So for a vocal species, we're pretty certain you're going to seeing a lot more of the audio data. In the first place, that if anywhere we looks like we're going to see an intersection between sound recording data and eBird data is in trying to meet some of the desires of the US Forest Service to understand better the population dynamics of pinyon jays in the southeast western United States. So that's something that 5-year time horizon, maybe longer, we're going to be involved in. We're definitely collecting audio data now. We're definitely also making use of the eBird data each by themselves to help make management recommendations. We haven't combined them yet, but hopefully it'll be coming. So those are the ends of the examples. And I want to leave you, if anything, with 4 points from a data analysis perspective of things you should think about and remember about eBird data. The first one is there are lots of data, but they're noisy data as well. And that means that to deal with the noise, to deal with the low signal to noise ratio, requires a lot of computation. So yes, we can find information in the data about birds, but it's not necessarily simple. So we do these computations, we're learning how to do them and ever improving how we're doing them. And we're doing them to try and meet the goals of partner organizations, principally in North America currently, probably more expanding now into Central and South America. And finally, eBird should never be considered a universal substitute for rigorous and carefully designed studies like the breeding bird survey or more specialized and localized surveys. They're good for different purposes, and ideally we can share information from them to actually improve our understanding of birds. So eBird is another tool to be used for bird management and conservation purposes. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and interest in this subject. I just want to leave you by saying when I started that there is a large group of people involved in the analysis of eBird data. And what you're seeing on your screen are most, but not all of the people currently involved in the processes of trying to figure out how to extract information from eBird's data for either these general status and trend products or for the very specialized tailored analyses of people. And this work could never have been done without funding from a variety of sources that are listed on the bottom of the screen. And with that, again, thank you very much for your attention. I will be stopping sharing my screen, and there hopefully will be time for questions.
So, okay, so I'm Doug Futum, a vice president of the Linnaean Society, and my role this evening is to read the questions that you, the audience, submit to the Q&A, and I might add one or two of my own questions along the way. But here we have first someone who says, "Thank you for giving this talk. Super interesting. How do you account for vagrant birds when you look at bird populations? For example, if 100 people say that they saw a vagrant bird, how do you keep that from affecting the range of that bird?" And that's a question that I'd thought of asking myself. So for example, there's been a Bohemian waxwing yesterday here in Long Island, and seen by, it may have been seen by a considerable number of people. But it's not uncommon for rarities, of course, to attract great numbers of people. So,
Mhm.
what's your answer to that question?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it definitely has been a problem in the past. How we do it is that,
Because you get redundant, in effect,
yeah,
redundant data, right?
redundant data, but redundant and highly localized
That's right.
data. And it's the highly localized part that I can't remember the exact process we use now, but effectively, you don't see a dot on a map unless there are actually not just one specific location for a species, but you need to have reports from a broader area than just a small location, or not location, or like small set of locations. So effectively, that it's an arbitrary rule that we've kind of hardwired into the analyses, and actually we've hardwired into the production of maps. So it's like after the raw predictions are made, then we look for these sort of outliers where they're just points that light up with a species, and we erase them. I mean, effectively, that's what we're doing. So there's sort of a cartographical step after all the computer analyses have been done.
Okay. If I can just add to that question before moving on to the next one. So a group of people go out and they look at birds together and they then they basically have a shared list.
Mhm.
Presumably you have a mechanism for eliminating that redundancy because there's in
Yeah,
effect one list, right? Yeah.
yeah. There's one list, but in the database, and if you were to download the raw data, the sharing the list literally means you take the starting list that somebody created and you create a duplicate copy for every person with whom you're sharing.
That's right. Yeah, right, exactly. So
And
is it one list or many then from your analytical point of view?
well, we actually know which lists are shared, how they're grouped
Yeah, of
together
course.
through the grouping. And so we just collapse the
You
information
do.
down to make
Okay.
one list out of it.
Okay, that's what I thought. Um, Deborah asks, thank you for this fascinating talk. Can eBird data be used for documenting the effect of avian influenza on bird populations, or presumably other catastrophes of that kind?
The information documenting that will exist in eBird data. Right now, like for our industrial analyses of data, that would not show up because as I'd mentioned with our trend graphs, we just have you're forcing a continuous pattern of some sort through the data, declines or increases. Um, so I'm just trying to think of cases where we usually leave like the waterfall analyses to Fish and Wildlife Service and their systematic surveys. So I can't think of where we've actually tried to do that. Um, Related to avian influenza, though, one other use for data from eBird is to try and understand how influenza will spread. So you expect transmission from wild bird to wild bird and wild birds to domestic birds in areas that have the greatest concentrations of susceptible species. And while we're not doing this in North America, I have colleagues in Europe who are using data from eBird and other sources in Europe to actually develop risk maps of where in Europe you would expect the greatest risk of transmission of avian influenza from wild waterfowl to domestic poultry. So the information should be there.
Mhm.
We sort of as a group are not involved in any research on that topic.
Mhm.
But the whole idea of part of the idea of developing what I've called the trajectory models is that we would be able to actually detect these sorts of fluctuations. It's just more complex than even the statisticians in our group thought. So
Okay. Sherry writes, I used to map data. Is eBird using GIS tools by ESRI Who makes the algorithms for analysis?
We gave up on using Esri products. So like ArcGIS, ArcMap. Everything you see is done in R software. R is a free statistical software package it's basically the go-to package for statisticians to do analyses and to develop new methods. When they develop new methods, they'll implement them first in R, and R also has sort of added on to it add-on products that allow you to do anything any other GIS package does. So we'd started with Esri products. It just didn't work out. I could go into gory details about
Okay,
it,
well,
but
let's not that. Chuck says, speaking of noisy data, will birders using recordings to attract birds possibly jade the data? For example, a red-hatted baboon in Central Park. Oh, I think I know what that's about. That's an in reference. But the question is, will birders who use recordings to attract birds have any impact on the data?
I deliberately did not mention anything about this, but I was expecting that question. And the answer is yes. How they're affecting the data, we're not sure yet. But I think people are probably mostly referring to another one of the apps we produce at the Lab of Ornithology, which is Merlin, that has a sound ID component to it, where you can just, and like even in Sapsucker Woods at the Lab of Ornithology, where when I'm walking to work, I can sometimes see people just walking around with their phones, having the phones do the bird watch, a lot of the bird watching for them.
Oh, yeah, but I think the question was about not basically having a more sensitive ear, so to speak, by using that, but rather using tapes to basically play tapes to birds to see if they're there, or to attract
Okay, that sort of thing. Yeah, yeah,
mobs
yeah, yeah.
to an owl tape, for example, mobs of mobbing birds, and so on. I mean, I can imagine ways in which that could influence, influence the nature of the data you get. My sense is that there is so many things that influence whether or not you accurately estimate the number of most species when you're out birding, that
So
that might not be
yeah.
such an important.
Some of it's noise. Some of it we are removing, because at least if bird watchers everywhere are like my friends and colleagues around Ithaca, New York, where I am, some people habitually pish for birds. Some people habitually play owl tapes for birds,
Right.
and other people don't. And we actually, as part of the analysis, for every observer in every region, we have created a number called we call the checklist calibration index, the
So
CCI.
you have one of those for me and one of those for Michelle and so forth.
We have one of those for every one of us for every time you're bird watching. Now it's effectively, it's an efficiency, it's a measure of how efficiently and how quickly you are accumulating more species through time, the observation period. And that can depend on a variety of things, including whether you're using playback tapes or pishing for birds. And for people who are consistently doing that, that number is actually rolled into as part of the information that we use to remove noise from the signal.
Okay, but you don't know whether I pish or not, do you?
We
Or
don't
do
have to know it. Well, if you're
okay.
doing it, if you're doing it consistently, it's accounted for. If you're doing it sporadically, it's like if you vary from time from like one part of the day to the other part, then it's just going to be noise. But even if you have like a 2-week period where suddenly you're playing tapes and pishing all the time, and then you stop doing it, we should be able to actually detect changes like that
Okay.
in the behavior.
Here's just a kind of an open-ended question here. I would like to know more about the quote-unquote noise factor.
Oh
You
dear.
have to figure out
How many hours do you
how do
have?
you how many hours do you have? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because yeah, I can get overly enthusiastic about that, which is I desperately tried not to do in the presentation itself. Oh, where to start? Noise is just a simple word for saying variation whose cause we don't know.
Right.
And a lot of what we have been doing, a lot of the time we spend, is to try and take this variation, things that identify the things that cause variation in the detection process, so that they're not unexplained noise, but they're actually things we can explain and we can remove. That's a lot of what we're doing in the data analysis group. And so in recent years, we have the checklist calibration index. That's something that came along in its first version 7 or 8 years ago. More recently, we've been including information about weather within like about an hour period around the observation process, because we know that it's not just the birds are actually changing in behavior. Like singing behavior can increase or decrease depending on the weather conditions, so that we can control for effects like that as part of the noise. Time of day could be considered noise, where you have bird species like singers in the dawn chorus. There can be very sharp drop-offs in singing rate shortly after dawn. So we control for changes we actually describe the pattern of change in detection rate, or effectively of singing rate of birds, by having time of day included in the models. So a lot of it, yeah, it basically, it's just a hunt for explanations for noise in the data. But at some level, there are things that we just can't explain, and they will
Oh.
never be explained. And in that
But
case,
that's I mean, basically that's pretty much true of any variable that is studied in biology. I mean, you could be studying the distribution of a plant species, for example, and there'll be some variables that stand out, like whether it's in fields or forests. But when you get down to the more micro level, it'll be it could be a lifetime's work really working out to fully explain the distribution of that species. So I think what you're saying is there's always some unexplained variation.
it's an inevitability, and there's more there's just more noise with eBird, because we're not like in an experiment. If you're trying to understand plants, you can have experimental plots. You can control as much as you can and just isolate one effect after the other. We don't have the option of doing
That's
that
right.
with eBird data.
Right.
So, but what you do with unexplained variation is you try and see if it is possibly obscuring patterns. So you're actually trying to, what we actually do with these analyses to validate whether we're finding noise, effects of noise, or realities, we cross-validate. So when we're building a model, we hold out about 20% of the data. We fit the model, we identify the patterns with the 80%. Then we see how well we can predict that 20%. And if we can predict the remaining 20% of the observations well, we know that we're actually, we're understanding the signal, both in the biological signal, and we're explaining the noise well. And we'll show it's when that happens that we have a publicly displayed map. If we are not, like the predictions, the cross-validation shows we're not doing a good job at all, those never see the light of day. You're never going to find them publicly. We're never going to publicly show something that we know is not a good description of what, or the best is a reasonable description of reality that controls for noise.
Thanks for that. Michelle asks, Has the eBird team started using any AI for their computational work? Is AI something the team is excited about leveraging?
Okay, I'll start with a stepping sideways with a statement that I actually don't like the term AI because it's just too vague. If you're talking about letting machines find patterns in the data as like effectively what artificial intelligence is doing, yeah, we've been doing this for 20 years, 25 years now. We're not using the sorts of large language models you're familiar with ChatGPT, and they're just not adapted. They're not designed to do the sorts of analysis that we're using. But we're using another group of models that are typically called machine learning models to actually find the patterns in the data. Like in university, you're taught statistical analyses where you actually say, I'm interested in only looking at the effects of this small number of predictor variables. And I expect that there's going to be like a straight line relationship between the predictor and the response, or some sort of a simple curve. We're not doing that because we're basically admitting that we don't know which are the important predictor variables. We throw 150 about into each one of the analysis models. We don't know what the forms of these relationships between like an environmental condition and the abundance of birds are. We let the computers do that for us, and that's what machine learning models are designed to do. So yeah, we're using models that are sort of cousins of ChatGPT, but they're the more intelligent cousin to use for our use. And we've been doing that since actually 2004, I think is when we started down that road.
You're pioneers. Peter asks, okay, this is a longish question here. Given the recipe, eBird, environment, effort, are there things we as birders might do to reduce the noise? That is to say, improve the recipe in data. For example, does providing more precise locations, weather conditions, such as cloud cover, etc., reduce the noise?
Okay. So weather conditions, no. It's basically it's something that from what we've been told and what we feel ourselves, it gets in the way of having fun birding. We can get the information about weather conditions globally to within about an hour of a checklist time from online resources. So products that actually tell us what the weather conditions were. What you as an individual can do to get the best sort of better quality data for us is first, you're almost certainly going to be traveling around on a birding trip. So what in eBird we call a traveling count. If you can turn on the track functionality where it actually lets the GPS unit in your phone record at intervals where you are located, the track you're using, we use that data. So currently we're just using it to find the single point at which we say a checklist was, but we're thinking in the future of actually creating actually a sort of a buffer around the track that somebody has, and then describing the habitat around that entire track. Another thing is to, instead of having one day-long checklist, divide up your day. It's like every time you're in a different book, in a different habitat, even have it start a different checklist. If you want to see all your birding results compiled for a day, we've created something called a trip list that actually aggregates all of the sightings from all of the checklists in a given day or basically any of them that you want to see what you have. So having not necessarily giving us more precise locations, but not moving around as much when collecting data on an individual checklist. And we realize it's within reason, but it gets more complicated, and the data get noisier if you go from like seashore to forest to urban all on one checklist.
Yeah.
Then that's creating noise. But if you were to divide that up into 3 chunks, that would be less noisy data. And then the most important thing is always complete lists, please, if you can at all do that. So by complete list, that means that you say that you're recording every species of bird that you detected during the period of observations. Because when you do that, we not only know which birds you saw, we know which birds you didn't see.
Right.
So we can add the zeros.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that relates to a question that I was inclined to ask, which is more or less, what are the most common failings that in people's checklists, or what are the things that we should be sure to do as opposed to not do? And you've just indicated one of those. I think is
Yeah.
importantly. I mean, for example, is it important to disaggregate birds seen in different habitats? If I move from ocean watching to a freshwater lake with very different sets of aquatic birds, should those be basically two separate lists as a matter of course? Um, or is that
Ideally,
something you would just figure out on your own somehow? Because it
we,
might all be listed as one park, a park
yeah,
that
yeah,
has some
yeah.
forest and and a pond at one end and the ocean at the other end. Because
Yeah.
we have such parks here. Yeah.
No, like ideally, yes, if they could be disaggregated by habitat, that would create cleaner data. But the way I started, it's like we're giving a tool to bird watchers to help them enjoy their birding hobby more. And we recognize that you can't, at some level, it just gets too burdensome for people to use eBird if they try to make sort of be too strict about what they're doing. Like I'm kind of in a, just because I'm a data analyst and a little bit obsessive compulsive about things, I can, like on a Christmas bird count, I can do 30 checklists in a day.
Okay.
I don't absolutely recommend, I absolutely recommend nobody try to do that. Yeah, unless it matches your personality. So like pragmatically, there is information in the data, large quantities of data, like in areas like New York City. um, it's easier for us to find the signal even with like people checklist crossing boundaries. There are places where it becomes challenging for us are places like the Amazon basin, where people are on birding tours, and quite typically the checklists are all day checklists.
Mhm.
And just because of the biogeography there, people can be maybe crossing a large river on one side and in the morning crossing the river birding on the other side, and they're different species, isolated species that have been
Mhm. Yeah.
isolated for millennia because of these different. And if you have a single day-long checklist, we lose that information. There's no
Yeah.
way of getting it back. And there's so few data from the Amazon basin that is one of our areas
Mhm.
in the Americas where we can't reliably model the distributions of
Mhm.
many bird species.
Mhm. Wow, that's distressing. Um, Here is who is this? Amanda asks, "Thank you for your talk. How useful?" And this relates to something you've been talking about. How useful or unhelpful is marking the number of birds with an X in eBird instead of the number of actual birds seen? For example, 100 ring-billed gulls versus X ring-billed gulls.
Okay.
Because this is very commonly done. People
Yeah,
don't like to count large numbers of gulls or sandpipers or whatever.
I know one or two people who do, but they are definitely the exception and not the rule. Um, well, okay. There are multiple parts to the answer. First part of the answer is the X's are used in analyses because when we're developing our models, we're using something that statisticians call hurdle models, where effectively it's a two-stage model where first we're predicting it's there or it's not there. And the X tells us it's there. And then for those locations where the bird is there, there's a second step where we actually do a model that describes variation in the numbers of birds. So if you have excess, you are minimally contributing to like the distribution, like the range map part of the analysis, but not to the relative abundance part. So yeah, the data are still being used. We are definitely using them, but we would love it if people could make estimates of counts. And internally, when we're discussing this, we haven't actually looked at how accurate we think we would like to recommend people to be. But frankly, if you're within an order of magnitude, that's better than an X.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, for really common species, those are one of the challenges, just because sometimes there are like millions, and other times maybe one bird.
That's right.
And
That's right.
trying to describe that variation is like it is a major problem in statistical analysis broadly, being able to do that. But yeah, order of magnitude, we'd love to get an order of magnitude estimate instead of an X. So it's like, you might count 10 birds and you say, okay, so these 10 look like 100, and then you just go 100, 200, 300, 400, or maybe 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, like that, to get a crude estimate.
That's right. Well, that's certainly what I think many of the birders I know do that, saying, okay, I can sort of count off by 50s or for large flocks of ducks, for example, things like that. And you learn, you kind of learn what 50 greater scaup look like, and then you say, okay, well, I guess they're about 1,800 here. Let's move on to the next. Richard says, great presentation. From a practical standpoint, as a Central Park birder, for example, is it that important to start and stop lists when moving from one place to another, from Strawberry Fields to the lake to the Ramble, etc., which would be different habitats within Central Park? If the data is that noisy, isn't a general Central Park list just as useful? So this is, I think of more, you've been talking about this to some extent, but maybe you could sort of give a summary answer to that. Yeah.
Pragmatically, there's the whole park checklist are still useful. Even if a small percentage of people have more localized lists within Central Park, that would be very valuable. But again, it's like bird, you're not going out to bird because you want to collect great data. You're going out to have fun. And to the extent that fun can be pushed towards collecting a little bit more rigorous sort of data, like more localized, we'd appreciate it. But we realize that we can't dictate what people do and what's too much stress, what's too much work for something that should be an enjoyable time out for someone.
Thank you. Harold writes, so Harold is evidently part of a group who's doing this. We are working to use complementarity of surveys, eBird data, modus tracking, and audio recording, for example, with Cornell Swifts, hoping to engage in shared stewardship efforts for migratory birds in New Jersey. Have there been efforts like that for any of the 57 species you noted in New York State? And are you involved in any similar efforts?
There are various people around. So the Lab of Ornithology has about 250 staff plus others. So we actually have acoustics people. We have some people who have been interested in using modus and tracking data, and we have the eBird people. And we just don't talk to each other enough. We're all busy in our own worlds. That I think we all know that we'd love to try and something coordinated like that, but I'm not aware of anything like that project that's happening currently at the Lab of O. Other groups, there are bits and pieces of effort. Like we have some people that are using, we have a radar ecology group. If you know Andrew Farnsworth, he's kind of the grandfather of that.
He preceded you as a speaker a few months ago. Yeah, a couple of
Okay,
months
okay,
ago.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we have people who are working to combine radar ornithology with to try and modus tracking data to try and be able to model actually flows of birds through space. Most of that work currently, let's see, there's some of the work being done in Colorado State by a former postdoc at the Lab of Ornithology. There's Benjamin Van Dorn, who's now at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, who's really interested in the acoustics plus radar. So there are people doing bits and pieces, and people realizing that there's sort of this grand destination, but I'm not aware of anybody who's actually trying to put everything together on a grand scale.
Mhm. Okay. Chuck asks, and again, a lot of there are a number of questions sort of that are variations on a theme. If a rarity is reported in a given area and an audio ID device picks up that rarity each time a birder walks past playing the bird's song, how does the data get interpreted? So in other words, there's very high redundancy.
There's high redundancy. So again, the model would pick up a very localized occurrence of a species. And then we would sort of have a somewhat arbitrarily make it disappear from the map of expected distributions of birds. So, but it's like everybody's checklist is treated as a different data point. So we would know that there was one species that was very highly detectable in one very, very, very localized area outside of its range. But yeah, it's something that we actually need this cartographic step effectively after the fact to remove these bright spots.
Okay. Peter Peter actually lists 3 questions here. I'm not sure that we'll cover all of them. He says, I frequently find misidentifications. How does that skew your data? And why can't I flag them?
Okay.
Now, of course, you do have eBird reviewers who I think review most lists.
Well,
And,
they would review them, but a record has to be flagged first, and that usually means it's an unusual report for an area. Misidentifications of common species like purple finch, house finch, don't get flagged.
Mhm.
So it would actually need like photographic evidence.
So who does the flagging?
In cases like that, I'm just trying to. An observation like that should be able to be flagged. Definitely, like the regional, the local reviewers
Right.
can do like manually flagging themselves and basically putting something in the queue for review.
Right. I mean, I have occasionally contacted the local reviewers to say, did you see that report? Sure,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
surely that's wrong, misidentified.
So I'm just thinking now again, I think it's possible for just anybody to flag an audio recording or a photograph as a misidentification, which presumably in a lot of cases is how somebody would know that there was a misidentification.
Mhm.
So those actually can be done from within, like just browsing the data on the website in eBird. The actual sightings without documentation like that, I think it's still that you actually need to like contact a reviewer
Mhm.
and point it out to them. But again, like I'm on the data analysis side, not on the data
Right.
management
Yeah.
side. So
Okay. Yeah.
I can't remember quite what the procedures were.
Right. Peter also asks, so why do you permit observers to remain anonymous or just use their initials?
Uh, well, the pragmatic answer is GDPR, like the European data privacy policies. And given that we're global, we have to comply with them. But we do take, I mean, we realize that there are some people who just, for very legitimate reasons, want to keep themselves anonymous. Other people, they might feel legitimate, but it might not. I mean, for some people, it actually is potentially seriously problematic if people were to be able to find where they were. So we have created mechanisms to allow people to remain anonymous but still share their records with eBird. So it's personal privacy. People have different levels of
Right.
comfort with sharing information about themselves.
Yeah. I may come back to Peter's third question, but I want to be sure that we have other people in the queue here. Joyce says, great presentation, and the questions asked were also very helpful with questions I didn't realize I had using eBird. So that's a compliment, not a question as such. Sandra, great presentation. Similar question. Are there any citizen science projects that combine Project Feeder Watch eBird data with bioacoustic recording data collection using bird weather PUC, for example? I don't know what that refers to, but
yeah, no, I do. No, that's a simple answer. The more
yeah.
complex answer is sort of how what I said close to the end of the talk. We know we're going to have to figure out how to combine acoustic data with eBird data and other observational data. It might seem simple, superficially simple to do that. It's not. Like one of the big differences in acoustic data, like if it's like from the bird weather devices, we don't, well, first there's a challenge in combining data from acoustic monitoring where you don't record turkey vultures as an example. So it's like there's a subset of species for which we know that they're data, there's subset for which there just aren't going to be any data. And effectively the data then, and we don't know the numbers as well from acoustics. We just know, is there a lot of chatter or not, but we don't know if it's one bird or 100. So there are enough differences between them, and that right now it hasn't been like a priority, and which in part means we haven't found a funder who's interested in actually funding the work to bring these things together. And I'm not aware of any group anywhere in the world that is working seriously on figuring out best methods for merging acoustic and like human observer data.
Interesting. Barbara says, Barbara writes, I was told it depends on the number of lists that you have submitted in the past year, whether you have the option to flag a misidentification.
Ah, okay. Yeah, no, again, it's not surprising there are some parts about how eBird operates that I don't know, but that's I'm just trying to think. I would not be the right person to contact. We actually, if there's a contact eBird, like a web form on the website, you could try to find the information from there, because those questions would go to one of the people whose jobs it is to work with birders. So for clarity on that, yeah, I'm afraid I'm just the wrong person.
Okay, I think that completes the questions. If anyone else has a question, ask now, or we will move on. I have to say, I just want to remark that I was an undergraduate at Cornell, and I'd go out to the lab. I think it was once a month or once every couple of weeks or whatever, that there would be a meeting for all the local people who were interested in coming out. And the lab was basically Arthur Allen and Peter Paul Kellogg, who initiated the bird sound library, or the natural sound library. And and I think there may have been one or two other people in the lab, and that was it. And now you said there are 250 people at the lab. I
I
mean,
think
that's
it's at least 250 staff plus students.
I mean, that is staggering. That is just amazing. And really wonderful. I mean, I mean, you can see why the Cornell Lab is obviously universally considered such a leader in ornithology.
No, but
I
I
think
was
it's
hired right at
wonderful.
I was hired right at the beginning of that real growth phase.
Uh-huh.
So when I arrived, there were fewer than 100 staff, and I think I was the seventh or eighth person who had a PhD, like was a
Mm.
professionally trained ornithologist.
Oh, really? Yeah, yeah.
And now it's like from my office, there's just a whole row of sort of office cubicles of postdocs. We don't have
Mhm.
room for graduate students anymore who had
Uh-huh. Yeah.
originally been in that space because we've got too many postdocs, or too many is a good thing in this case.
Too many PhDs. Anyway, thank you so much, Wesley, for this presentation. I mean, obviously the number of questions clearly showed what I expected, which is that since so many birders use eBird, that inevitably there'd be a lot of interest in just knowing what you do with it and how it works, and we having a much greater sense of familiarity with what we are doing, besides just keeping track of our own birding experiences. But that when we submit eBird checklists, that we're contributing to research in one way or another in the long run.
Mhm.
So very good. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Very, very
Thank you,
welcome.
Wesley. That was a great presentation.
So, okay. So good night, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.